Hello, I'm Anna Maria Tremonti, and this is The Current. Many authors might be flattered if their books received so much attention, but Michael Mann, perhaps not so much. A few weeks before his new book was published, reviews started appearing on Amazon. Lots of scathing one-star reviews. If you're wondering why people would have such negative opinions about a book they hadn't read, it might help to know that Professor Mann is a climate scientist at Pennsylvania State University. He is the creator of the hockey stick graph, a zigzagging line that shows global temperatures over hundreds of years. In the last century, it curves upwards like, well, a hockey stick. That graph made Professor Mann one of the most polarizing figures in climate science. To some, the graph is a powerful evidence of human-made climate change. Doubters see it as a symbol of flawed science, even fraud. Professor Mann has been the target of personal threats and attacks on his scientific integrity. He has also been the subject of several investigations into allegations of academic and scientific misconduct. He has always been exonerated. His new book is called The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars: Dispatches from the Front Lines. And as part of our Game Changer project, Michael Mann joins me in our Toronto studio. Good morning.
Good morning, Anna Marie. It's great to be with you.
So your book started getting attacked before it was even released. How surprised were you?
I'd like to say I was surprised, but we sort of, in a sense, we expected these attacks. After all, my book, to some extent, is about my experiences as sort of an accidental and reluctant public figure in this larger debate over human-caused climate change and the attacks that I've been subjected to over the years. And so there's a certain irony to being attacked in this way over a book that is really about the attacks against the science and against the scientists like myself.
Goes around and around and around, huh? So let's get back to the beginning. Tell us about the hockey stick. What does it show?
So this is an estimate that my co-authors and I published more than a decade ago to try to extend the temperature record back in time. We only have about 100 years of widespread thermometer measurements. We know the globe has warmed by a little less than 1 degree Celsius, but we don't know from thermometer records alone whether that warming is unusual in a longer-term context. And so we turn to what we call proxy data, indirect measures of climate like tree rings and corals and ice cores to extend the record back in time. And in our original study, we extended those temperatures back 600 years, followed up by an extension back to the past 1,000 years in 1999. And what that showed was a long-term decline from the relatively warm conditions during the medieval time into the depths of the Little Ice Age, followed by an abrupt warming over the past century that was without precedent for at least the past 1,000 years.
Hence the graph that makes it look like a hockey stick.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did that hockey stick and you become such a controversial flashpoint in what you call the climate wars?
Well, it was that graph ended up being featured in a very important report, the Summary for Policymakers of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And it's that summary for policymakers that is really widely seen by government representatives, by policy people, and gets the most prominence in coverage of the UN climate science reports. So once it was featured in that report, it became an icon in the climate change debate. I think that helped propel it onto sort of the public stage as an icon of climate change. And,
well, it's because it's easy to imagine too, right? Everybody can picture it in their mind.
Well, exactly. It doesn't require, you don't have to understand the mathematics of a theoretical climate model to understand what that graph is telling you, that recent warming is anomalous in this long-term context. It's a finding that's now been reproduced by dozens of studies, and yet our original graph remains a flashpoint and an icon.
You talk about something called the Serengeti strategy in terms of how you have been targeted in all of this. Well, what are you talking about? Yeah,
so I sort of start out in the prologue. I talk about an experience I had back in the late 1990s when I was a co-author on one of the chapters of the IPCC report. And we held this meeting out in Arusha, Tanzania, and I actually had a chance to go out to the Serengeti, and I saw this scene of zebras and this wall of stripes that they form as a way to try to protect themselves against predators. When predators like lions see this wall of stripes, they can't select out a single vulnerable individual to attack. And so what I allude to is in that early scene, early in my career, unbeknownst to me, that scene had profound implications for what I and other climate scientists would be subject to, because we were the zebras at the edge of the herd that would be singled out by the predators, in this case, those looking to discredit climate science and to discredit individual scientists, to make an example of individual scientists, so that other scientists would not step up and participate in the public discourse. And I think it's a very it's a very specific and pernicious strategy that's been used to try to intimidate scientists from speaking out about this problem.
Now, Stephen McIntyre is a Toronto-based blogger who runs a website called climateaudit.org. He is often credited as having debunked the hockey stick argument. First of all, what do you say to people who tell you your argument has been debunked?
Well, it's unfortunate that these days, a lie or a myth that's repeated often enough somehow becomes accepted as fact in some circles. And if you actually look at what the science has to say, if you look at the findings of the most recent reports of the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S., the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change study, what all of these and dozens of additional findings, additional studies, independent, studies over the past decade and a half. Not only has our original conclusion that this recent warming is anomalous in 1,000 years, not only has that been reaffirmed, but it's actually been extended. We now know that the recent warming is likely anomalous in an even longer-term context. And so our specific results have been reproduced, but more importantly, this is the way science advances. Other scientists have used independent approaches, different types of data, to approach the problem from a different angle and have come to the same conclusion time and again.
And yet that persists, that it's been debunked.
Yeah, well, like I said, there is this sort of what we call an echo chamber of disinformation. It's out on the internet. You can find it on talk radio. You can find it in throughout the public discourse. There is this echo chamber in which statements that are false and have been proven false many times over are nonetheless repeated as if they're true. And if they're repeated often enough, in some circles, they become accepted as fact.
I want to address something else that you have had to confront. You became notorious in the so-called Climategate affair after your email correspondence with other prominent climate scientists was hacked. Your critics said the emails showed you were doctoring or hiding data that didn't fit your conclusions and that you were basically part of a scientific cabal trying to silence people who did not agree with your view of climate change. That argument still resonates in some circles today. How do you respond?
Well, again, it's this, this principle that that there are certain, memes that continue on, even though they've been entirely rejected. In the case of these stolen emails, so a hacker broke into a university server, stole thousands of emails between various climate scientists, including mine. I don't think it was coincidental that this all happened in the lead up to the Copenhagen summit in 2009, and it was used, in essence, this manufactured scandal was used to try to scuttle any progress on dealing with the climate change problem at this very important summit, this international summit. So what happened were these emails were stolen, and certain individuals and organizations that were helping sort of promote this manufactured scandal took various words and phrases out of context to try to make it, basically exploiting the fact that scientists often speak in lingo. We use, for example, the term trick to denote a clever approach to solving a problem, but to somebody who isn't familiar with the culture of science, they see the word trick, and somebody who's looking to make some mischief can take that out of context and try to make it sound like the scientists were fudging the data. Suffice it to say, there have now been, I think, 9 different investigations in the U.S. and the U.K. By various government institutions. Most recently, the Inspector General of the National Science Foundation in the U.S., basically the highest authority in the land when it comes to evaluating, the viability and the authenticity of scientific findings. And all of these investigations have found that there was no evidence of wrongdoing. And ultimately, what it was is the journal Nature reported in an editorial was an attempt to try to, once again, to smear scientists and to try to, I think, erode the public's confidence in science. I think it was a very directed effort to try to attack the integrity of the scientific community, erode the public's confidence in science, because those who are looking, again, to scuttle any action to deal with the climate change threat understand that all they need to do is introduce enough doubt into the public discourse. And if there's enough doubt and uncertainty, then nothing will happen. And that's their agenda.
And as I said in our introduction to you, you have been exonerated in all of these investigations. What was that experience like for you, the whole Climategate?
Well, I try to convey some of that in the book. It's difficult because, as I said, I was a reluctant and really almost accidental entrant into the public stage when our work became very prominent in the late 1990s. I got interested in science as a young child. I was always fascinated by tornadoes and time travel and all of these things. And so from the earliest days that I can remember, I loved science. I got interested in science early on. I studied physics in college, went on to begin doing theoretical physics, a PhD in theoretical physics, then got very interested in this wide open problem at the time where I could use the math and physics I'd learned to work on this huge problem of understanding how Earth's climate works. And I never imagined in all of that I would end up becoming a central figure in a political debate. That's not anything you ever expect as a scientist. Like I said, I was sort of a reluctant public figure. But over time, as I began to understand sort of the depths of, frankly, of dishonesty in those looking to discredit the science, I realized that I had a larger responsibility to stand up for the science, not just myself, but to stand up for the science in general and to try to use the position I had now found myself in to help educate the public about the reality of the problem and the real challenges that we face.
But that sideswiped you. That was not what you thought you'd be doing at this point in your career. No, not at all. And, like I said, I became a reluctant participant in this debate, but I have grown to embrace it over time. Are you angry? I'm not so much angry as just saddened and disappointed that this is the level, of discourse, that we're still having this bad faith debate about whether or not the problem is real, when we could be spending our time having the worthy debate about what to do about the problem. And we're still stuck in this intellectually dishonest debate about whether climate change is even real, and it's unfortunate. What kinds of attacks and threats have you had to deal with personally as a result of all of this? Well, I've had threats against my safety, threats against my life, threats against my family. I have received white powder in an envelope. I describe this all in the book. The FBI actually had to send the letter off to a lab. It came back negative. It turns out it was cornmeal. But you literally got the mail one day and that was in it. Absolutely. And what ran through your mind that day? What ran through my mind is, how am I going to explain to my colleagues in what we call the Happy Valley, State College, Pennsylvania, a very amicable, town, a university town, a very collegial university. How was I going to explain to them why there was police tape over the office to my door? And these are the sorts of discussions that I have to have with my colleagues who I'd like to be talking to about science and research and teaching and everything else that one likes to do as a researcher and a professor. But unfortunately, this is a fact of life for me. I have to deal with these sorts of things. Well, and it's not solely threats and anonymous things in the mail from anonymous sources. You've had lawmakers try to sue you in the United States. Absolutely. Most recently, the Attorney General of Virginia tried to seize all of my correspondences, all my emails and documents from the time that I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia, with the justification that he wanted to ferret out the fraud of human-caused climate change. And he was attempting to use a seldomly
used legal maneuver available to an attorney general to investigate government fraud. Just about a week and a half ago, the state Supreme Court of Virginia rejected his suit, and they rejected it with prejudice, meaning he can't come back. And so, at least at that level, at the level of the top legal authority in the state, there was a recognition that he had gone too far. And in fact, the Washington Post, I think, published 6 editorials blasting Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General, for this obvious overreach, for this effort to intimidate scientists, to try to sort of create this boundary where scientists would understand that if you cross that boundary, if your research findings prove inconvenient to certain vested special interests that fund certain political campaigns, will come after you. There was a recognition, I think, by the courts and by sort of across the land that we had. This was taking things too far.
Well, it's not like they didn't try, though. The Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe actually wanted a criminal investigation against you as well. Yeah,
and something else I talk about in the book. There's a movie, The Manchurian Candidate. It's about the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s, where people whose views might not be palatable to influential politicians were accused of being traitors and were being, subject to witch trials in the U.S. Congress. And there's a famous moment in the movie where this one senator states that there are precisely 57 communists in the U.S. Congress that should be investigated. Well, James Inhofe couldn't find 57 climate scientists, but he did come up with a list of 17 leading climate scientists in the U.S., including some of the leading researchers in our field, who should be subject to an investigation for perpetrating what he considers the fraud of human-caused climate change. And again, it's worrying because we thought that we got past all that in the 1950s, and yet we're still seeing these inquisitions, these efforts to attack scientists, once again, whose findings might be inconvenient to in the case of Inhofe, he's the single leading recipient of fossil fuel money in the U.S. Senate, and obviously doing the best he can to advance their agenda against the good of the public.
Well, I've got some tape here, and he's part of that. Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe. He's got a book, The Greatest Hoax: How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. This tape is also of the Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum, who has said repeatedly that climate change is a hoax. Listen to some of what they have been saying recently.
I did some checking into the science only to find out that they had rigged the science. This book covers it, how the United Nations rigged this thing all the way through.
So you're saying, sir, it's just a hoax. It's not being caused by people. And meanwhile, you got environmentalists and people on the political left in this country who are standing by trying to use it as a convenient excuse to redistribute wealth in this country.
That's exactly right.
Oil.
Drill. Everywhere.
Coal?
Absolutely. Natural gas. We have huge stores, 263 years of oil at current rate, almost 200 years of gas, and almost 300 years of coal.
What about global warming?
There is no such thing as global warming. It is, in my opinion, you have hundreds of factors that cause the Earth to warm and cool, and a trace gas of which human participation in this trace gas
This could seal the deal for me. This could seal the deal for me. It's whatever. Yeah. I got enough.
Okay, you got enough.
Okay, that was Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum, interviewed by Glenn Beck on Fox News. Before that, Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe, also interviewed on Fox News. Michael Mann, what goes through your mind when you hear them talk about climate change as a hoax or a socialist plot to redistribute wealth and control people's lives?
I wonder if they still want to debate whether the Earth is flat, whether the sun revolves around the Earth. It's so disconcerting that the public discourse can be filled with anti-scientific nonsense from some of our politicians at the highest levels. And it gets back to this issue. We're having this bad faith debate about whether the science is even real, when we could be having the good faith debate about what to do about it. And Santorum, alludes to, coal, natural gas, energy policy. We can have a good faith debate about that. But what they have to say about the underlying science is just absurd. And just one point I'd like to make here is this notion that, climate change is an elaborate hoax. You get 3 scientists in a room, they'll have a tough time disagreeing, a tough time agreeing on just about anything. What science is about is the give and take of intellectual discourse, of challenging ideas, of forcing each other to provide the strongest arguments they can possibly provide. That's the self-reinforcing mechanism that keeps science moving increasingly towards a better understanding of the world. And to imagine that thousands of scientists around the world have conspired to create this hoax, and they've gotten sea level and sea ice and global temperatures to all play along in that hoax is just literally unimaginable. And it's just remarkable to me that we're actually discussing that, in public, that we have politicians who are actually trying to make that argument. It's deeply disconcerting.
You write in your book that climatologists have to recognize that they're in a street fight.
Well, I was actually quoting the journal Nature, and I think it's very telling because this is a very stolid journal. Nature is the world's most respected scientific journal. It dates back centuries. It's extremely conservative in terms of the positions that it takes. And for a journal like Nature to come out and use language like that, or for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences to use similar language in characterizing the attacks that our science is being subject to, is an extremely strong statement. What it means is that the attacks have gotten to the point where even the most conservative voices in the scientific establishment have stepped up to say, look, that's enough.
How comfortable are you as a scientist with becoming more of an activist on this issue?
Well, I'm often, criticized. People say I'm an advocate. I've become an advocate. And I'll say, yes, I have become an advocate. I've become an advocate not for specific policies. I don't believe it's my role to, tell people what our energy policy should be, whether we should pass a cap and trade agreement or a carbon tax. What I am an advocate for is having a good faith discussion of these choices and making sure that the public discourse is informed by an accurate and honest assessment of the science, rather than the silliness that we just heard a few moments ago coming from some of our politicians. So
you're making the point that you want to be an activist to defend the science, not to actually decide the policy.
Yeah, and to defend the science and to inform the policy decision-making process, not to prescribe the policy-making process, but to inform it, to make sure that it is informed by an accurate assessment of the scientific evidence.
People talk about climate skeptics. Is that a word you use? What do you?
Yeah, it's funny because many of those who would gladly seize the mantle of climate skeptic, I would not by any stretch of the imagination call a skeptic. Skepticism in science is essential. All good scientists should be skeptics. We should always be challenging each other. We should be always forcing our fellow scientists to defend our claims, our conclusions, our findings. And like I said before, that's what keeps science moving forward, is that healthy skepticism. But one-sided skepticism is no skepticism at all. And what I mean is those who are perfectly willing to claim that established science, like the greenhouse effect, which is nearly 2 centuries of established science, is wrong, and to do so based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't hold up to the slightest bit of scientific scrutiny, that's not skepticism at all. That's contrarianism, or in its most severe form, denial. And, you have to call a spade a spade. Those who are denying established science are deniers. They don't like the term sometimes. They wish they would be called skeptics, but they're not being skeptics. They're being contrarians, or they're being deniers.
And is there enough discussion on what to do about climate change then, in your mind, amongst policymakers?
Well, I think we've been, frankly, sidetracked over the past few years in the U.S., and unfortunately, I think we've seen some of that sort of creep into Canada in recent years, where the worthy discussion of policy choices and what to do about the problem has been sidetracked by this inauthentic, this disingenuous argument about whether climate change is even real.
Michael Mann, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Michael Mann is the director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Pennsylvania State University. His new book is The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, Dispatches from the Front Lines, and he's in our Toronto studio. That is our program for today. Stay tuned.